All right, recording is started. Today's topic, once again, for the masses, today's topic is strengthening and weakening questions. And let's go ahead and do one. How about this one right here? How about that one? Okay, here's a timer. This one has more words than usual, which means we should give you more time than usual, so here's a decent chunk of time. Remember where to find multiple choice answer options. Those are found here. Sorry, I just screwed the question around. There's where you find multiple choice answers. Okay, have fun. Okay, that's kind of a lot of time, so let's go ahead and be done pretty soon. Remember the way the GMAT works. If you're not new to this, you'll know that I'm going to nag, but you have to answer the questions. On the flip side, you cannot not answer the questions. Remember the way the test works. It's an adaptive test that progresses through questions and determines what you're going to get next on the basis of what you've already seen. So what that means, among other things, is that you get one question at a time. You have to answer each question in the order that you get it, and there's no such thing as leaving questions blank. So there are a few of you guys. This is the biggest turnout I remember, actually, 45 people so far. But there are a few of you who don't have multiple choice answers, so please answer the question. And remember that the multiple choice answers are found here. So please don't type the letter in the box. Please don't do it. If your name is semicolon, LJK, etc., this is where to type the multiple choice answers, not the chat box. Okay. All right. And sorry, okay, don't worry, apology accepted, but just type it in check choice there. Okay, also, please don't type this letter twice. Please don't indicate it twice, because if you indicate it twice, it'll turn it off. Okay, so here are the responses from the group. So it looks like there is a choice that is a clear favorite. Well, let's talk about this. So people like choice C here. Let's see what's going on. So remember, the purpose of critical reasoning is basically to exercise your abilities to think in a sort of real world sense, especially when it comes to strengthening, weakening questions, and so on. So what you want to do with these things, especially when there are this many words, it's a lot of words. What you want to do is simplify the argument. And simplify is an awfully abstract word that frankly doesn't really mean a whole lot. So instead of simplify, let's call it explain to a 10-year-old. I find that to be a very helpful way to think about this. Because most people, if you put them in front of an actual fifth grader, are pretty good at explaining things in a simplified form. Whereas you just tell them, simplify this, they don't really know what that means. So let's explain this argument to a 10-year-old. What does this say? Well, okay. Because I mean, there's just so many words. You want to get a sense of what the argument has to say. So there's a study of people who had lost weight. So people who had gotten on the wagon of exercising and actually had lost weight and started a workout program and so on. But they found that most of them had gained the weight back and or stopped exercising regularly. Okay, fine. But then they were surprised to discover, so what we're trying to explain here is why the surprising thing happened. So we're not really trying to explain why they gained the weight back. What we're trying to explain is this weird discovery, which is that the people in the study, even more of them, had regained the weight if they had hired personal trainers. In other words, what this is saying in fewer words is that, I mean, all of the people had tended towards gaining weight back or stopping the workouts. But basically, if someone in the study had a personal trainer, that person had one when they were younger, in their 20s. If someone had a trainer in their 20s, then that person was actually more likely to have regained weight or stopped working out by their 40s. So this is what we want to explain, right? We want to explain this weird finding that people who had personal trainers were even more likely to have gained the weight back. So what we don't want here is some sort of general explanation for why the weight gain happened. So instead, we want an explanation for this. That's the weird thing. And if you make this simpler and if you put it into fewer words, it's going to be easier for you to see what the actual issue is at hand. So, like, this is the issue. Not just the fact that lots of people gained the weight back, but this specific thing. And notice what you can do is, if you simplify this argument down, it'll just be easier for you to see this. Okay, there you go. Next thing you want to do is translate what the question means. Because, okay, the thing is with general questions, in real life, we just don't really like them. So this is an annoyingly general question. What most weakens the argument is not something that has an apparent meaning to our intuition. So, you know, this is too general. General questions like this, human intuition doesn't like them. It really doesn't. So, for instance, if someone says to you, hey, why are you acting like that? Or explain yourself. I mean, even though, especially explain yourself, that sounds like literally the most general question that anybody could ever ask you. I mean, if you took that question super literally, then explain yourself would mean, you know, just tell me anything about yourself at all that explains your conduct. But it's not what it means, right? Explain yourself means in specific situations, why are you doing exactly what you are doing right now in this very specific situation. So same thing with most weakens the argument. You should not leave it as most weakens the argument. You should translate this into terms that are specific. And once you have simplified the argument down into specifics, you can do this more readily. So translate the question into specifics. Okay. The argument is about why personal trainers candidates from the 20s had even more issues with it. So it's not so much why had people gained the weight back, because they admit that that's true. Like, the researchers understand that weight management and staying on a program and not working out and not giving up on it is hard. But this is what they're really trying to account for. So why did the personal trainer group have even more trouble with this? That's the real question that we're trying to answer here. Okay, so let's talk about that. And remember that when you have these answer choices, you don't want to try to relate them in any sort of formal logic type of way. You just want to think of them in real world terms whether they address this issue. But notice the criteria that we need in an answer choice. Like once you've translated the question into specifics, what you want to do is understand the criteria that any correct answer choice must address. So it's got to be something, the first thing is that it has to be something that is outside the scope or boundaries of the current statements. That's the first thing. It must be new information, in other words. In any problem where you have to strengthen or weaken anything, that's always true. Always, always, always. You cannot strengthen or weaken an argument by giving statements that are already there. So it can't be something that's already there. And that's something that's true in general of all strengthening, weakening type questions. And then the other thing is, in this case, it has to be something that specifically addresses the issue of the personal training group. So it has to be something that would promote both of these ideas. It has to be relevant specifically to the personal training group as opposed to other groups. That's one thing. So the color blue will make that criterion here. Must pertain specifically to the personal training group. And then it also has to do with the criterion that I'm going to make brown here, which is already there as in, already encapsulated in the prompt, exactly. It's already there. Because I mean, think about a real world argument that you're presenting with somebody. If you just repeat yourself, all you're going to do is annoy the person, and you're not making a more compelling case, right? So it also has to be something that will give you, will create some kind of trouble with weight management or with health and so on. I mean, this is the big thing that people have issues with. Let me go ahead and just riff on this topic on the next page real quick before we come back and talk about this problem. So we have explain to a 10-year-old, we have translate the question into specifics, and then we have understand the criteria that any correct answer must address. We'll answer this question here in a second. What I want to do first is just talk quickly about criteria like that, because a lot of people have trouble with this. And let's explore the issue of why. All right, let's say that I have a conversation with someone like this, and they say, this is kind of a weird conversation, but bear with me here. The person says, okay, I'm going to wear my new blue suit tomorrow to work. And I say, oh, you shouldn't wear that suit tomorrow, because tomorrow's Tuesday. And the person is like, huh? They're like, what? And I say, okay, blank. I mean, what kind of thing goes into blank? I mean, you don't have to give me a specific example of it, but whatever I say here has to address two issues, which are what two issues? So go ahead and tell me in the chat box. When I say something here, it has to have to do very specifically with two things, which are what two things? Okay, so what do you guys have in the chat box? Yeah, it's got to have to do with wearing a suit. maybe blue suit in general, but maybe just suits. And it has to do with Tuesday. So notice what would not be an appropriate answer here. Notice what would absolutely and immediately not be an appropriate answer. So for example, if I said something like, if I said, well, that suit is really, really hard to dry clean, that doesn't make any sense. You know, in this conversation, you would be like, what? You would be thoroughly lost. Because I am still not addressing the Tuesday issue. Like, this would be a reason to generally not wear that suit very much at all, but it would not qualify my comment about Tuesdays. You'd still be like, okay, why Tuesday? In other words, I'd have to give you something. I mean, you would have criteria automatically in mind, which would be, it has to be relevant to your blue suit, to not wearing it. And it also has to be relevant to Tuesday. And I mean, this is absolutely not genius and should not seem like genius to anybody in this room. But when people approach these critical reasonings as though they were academic problems, that's when this gets really hard. Because it seems like it's all of a sudden really hard to have a focus on more than one thing at a time. So the point that I want to make about this is that in a conversation, it would be absolutely unthinkable to not have a focus on these things. Like you would just immediately understand exactly what sort of box your answer had to fit into, because you just would. Because you are a human being who has conversations with other people, and that's just kind of how it works, right? So in a conversation, in other words, these focus points would be obvious and immediate. But if you made the mistake of viewing this as an academic problem, which is unfortunately the way that a lot of people approach critical reasoning, a lot of them, it would be very difficult to maintain the same focus. It would be literally a focus that is obvious if you were having a conversation with people. It would be very, very, very hard to maintain. So, like, back to this. Like, if you were talking to somebody about this, like, make these a conversation. Because then you will understand exactly how your response has to look. When someone's like, hey, I read this study, you know, it's like, all right, fine. A bunch of people had gained back weight by the time they were 40 because, you know, that sort of happens when you get older. It's a thing. But what was weird, the person is telling you, what was weird about the study was that, like, they looked at people who had trainers, and those people were especially likely to regain the weight. And we really want to figure out why that's a thing. I mean, if you're talking about this with somebody, you will know that you have to explain the special weirdness of the personal trainer group. You just know that. It's got to be. It's got to be the personal trainer group that is weird. So now let's talk about that with this in mind. So here is the question. Let's take it on to, let's take it on a new page. Erwin, there's a question directed at you there, and as you almost certainly know, I have no chance of being able to answer the tech questions. So it's all you right there. Here is what we said about that. So we have to pertain to the training group, and we have to create some kind of trouble. Okay. So choice A, it's a good start, right? It talks about the personal training group, right? This is definitely relevant to that. And then if they lack sufficient motivation, will they be more likely to fall off of the training wagon? Absolutely, because they can't do it by themselves. So if you think about choice A, this explains what we want to explain perfectly. That's a choice that we want, because it says that the people who are in that group are going to be, in large part, people who needed the help of the personal trainer to stay on these programs in the first place. And so, you know, very few people are going to maintain a personal trainer for 20 years. So that would totally explain it. As far as the other choices go, B tells you a reason why people would hire personal trainers, but so if this were a reason to create trouble with maintaining weight loss or exercise, it would be okay. But there's no reason to think that that's true. Like, in other words, for B to be the correct answer, these ideas of weight loss or rehabilitation would have to directly lead to the conclusion it would be more likely for these people to have trouble. So here, there's no reason to believe that. There's no reason to believe these individuals would have more trouble maintaining their shape. So, doesn't it refer to the yeah, and if you are criticizing verb tenses in a critical reasoning problem, that's issues. I mean, remember that this is not sentence correction. I mean, if your thoughts about these passages depend on the tense of a verb, that probably means you're not really thinking about this the right way. But, you know, studies are like that, right? That's kind of what studies do. I mean, studies are meant to elucidate general ideas. So, meaning that what happens in this study presumably extends to people who are outside the study. So it's not a problem if we are making general present conclusions, because that's what studies are for, right? That's actually the whole reason why people do research. You know, and we don't study this group of people to find out what is up with this group of people. Well, we study this one group of people to find out what is up with people in general, right? It's like, you know, just think of anything as a study. And I mean, this is one of those things that if you don't have an academic mentality, this is the most obvious thing ever. Like if you say, we tracked like 500 people and we found out that the people who smoked more developed lung cancer more. So this means that people who smoke are more likely to develop lung cancer. You would probably not have an issue with that. I mean, tracking those people shows you that people in general who are not necessarily those people are more likely to have lung cancer. So, same sort of thing. Just, again, all of these things, if anyone is nitpicking things like verb tenses, that's a sign more than anything else that people are doing this, which they should really not do. They should really not view this as an academic problem. It's, once you get out of that viewpoint, this test is a lot better in general. Same thing with C. C is a general fact. C doesn't have anything to do with the personal trainer group specifically. So this would explain why. This explains why the researchers already accept what they accept. So like this explains the part that it's hard to stay on a program. But this doesn't explain the part that needs explaining the most. In other words, the weird result of the personal training group. It doesn't explain that. So that's the whole point, is trying to explain that. And then as far as D goes, many of the personal trainers were dietitians who helped their clients design meal plans. I mean, the problem there is that, you know, meal plans don't really drastically change as you get 10 or 20 years older. So if anything, this would mean that the personal training clients had meal plans and the non-personal training clients didn't have those, which in terms of expectations would actually lead us to believe that the personal training group would be less likely to have issues. Yeah, that's what it means. I mean, this means the PT group has meal plans to whatever extent, while the other group may not. So this would actually point in the opposite direction. So there. But that would make us think actually that the opposite would happen here. That doesn't help us explain this result at all. I mean, it doesn't weaken or strengthen this claim because it just disagrees with the data entirely. Like it just basically confuses us as to why this works the way that it does. So that's what D does. A doesn't strengthen. I mean, the best way I can answer that question is that A doesn't strengthen the argument because it weakens the argument. I mean, that sounds like kind of a stupid answer, but the argument is that personal trainers basically are bad at doing what they're supposed to do in the long term. But if A is true, then it suggests that it's not the fault of the trainers at all. It suggests that people have, as soon as they stop doing personal training, just fall back off the wagon, so to speak. So, there. Tracy, that's the point, is actually to address that part of the issue. Because again, the researchers already accept that this is hard for people. So, in terms of this purple underline, let me put your question on the board. There's two ways to answer this. The first way is to point at things that are in the passage. So that's what I've done with the purple underline all there. I mean, the researchers already accept the notion that gaining weight is really hard for people in their 40s. But to not gain weight is really hard. So in other words, this is already a thing. The overall phenomenon, they already buy that. So this just confirms what they already agree with. So that's the one thing. The other thing is that that's just not the issue. I mean, again, if you imagine having a conversation with anyone about this, you will understand that that is not really the point. The point is to explain the most salient, strangest, weirdest result that they talk about. You know, because, okay, like let's say I tell you that in 5th grade last year, the whole class grew a little bit, but one kid grew like 3 feet. And I'm wondering why that is. If I'm talking to you about that, you know that you have to explain why the kid grew by 3 feet. But you cannot respond with something like, oh, well, kids are generally still growing in 5th grade. Because that just doesn't address the issue. That would be a really weird response in any sort of conversational context. It just would. And that's something that you cannot really do reading academically that you could do if you think about it as a human social interaction, is you will just understand immediately what issues are important and what issues are not. So, I mean, those words are also a hint, but honestly, again, you should try your best to imagine this as a real-life scenario. Because then those words will not only be hints, they will not only be little tiny hints, but it will be very, very clear, to the point of being almost obvious what is the issue to pay attention to and what is not. And again, think about this, right? If someone says this to you, you understand immediately that you have to address Tuesday. You know, something like, oh, on Tuesday you're meeting with some startup people who are very informal dressers and who will be put off by people who dress too formally. Okay, that makes sense. You know, if you meet with your venture funding people, not the VCs, but the companies you're funding, and they're full of hipsters who wear informal clothes on Tuesdays, then maybe, sure, you don't want to wear a suit. And you'll just understand what, in a conversational context, you'll just get it. It'll just happen. It'll be a thing. So, I mean, you can see the hints like that will be there because they do have to give you questions that are legit, but it's better if you don't even need to bother with small hints because you're imagining talking to somebody about this. And then, yeah, Anna, exactly. A weakens the idea that it was the trainer's fault, and that's where we're going with that. E, subjects who had hired personal trainers had more time. Same problem as D here, right? Because this would mean we would expect the opposite of what. This doesn't explain anything. Because we would actually expect the opposite of what was observed. So, there you go. All right, so again, in summary, what you want to do is these things. You really want to simplify down. You want to explain this to a 10-year-old. If a 10-year-old doesn't work for you, imagine you have to explain it to someone who doesn't understand your language very well. Because, I mean, people who don't speak your language that well, speaking to such individuals is a lot weirdly similar to speaking to someone who is, 10, 11, 12 years old, in terms of the way that you have to break things down into relatively simple things. So that's a pretty good way effective way to think about it. So here are the 3 things that you want to do with strength and weaken questions. So just keep this in mind. You want to explain to 10-year-old in every question, not just strength and weaken. Same thing with translate the question in specific. In fact, these are pretty good general guidelines for CR in general. So let's do that. Let's do those things with the questions that we see from here onward. Let's go to another one here. I think there's one more question in the chat box, so let's address that. Yeah, I don't know how to say that name. So random keyboard hitter person. It doesn't, but it's kind of common sense that people are not going to retain a personal trainer for 15 or 20 years. I mean, it's just, these questions do depend on common sense. They really do. Almost every single one of these questions has some sort of element that involves real world understanding of how things work and how people operate. And so, like, when it comes to something like, yeah, Kegel Figel, I guess that's pretty good. When it comes to the way that people operate, you do have to exercise a little bit of understanding of the real world. I mean, how many people are really going to keep a personal trainer for 15 years? I mean, maybe not nobody, but not most people, because they just don't. I mean, a computer would not know that, but that's actually the point of critical reasoning, is that you have to use insights that computers don't have. So, all right, let's look at another question. Let's look at this one. This one is actually from our materials. Give it a shot. Remember where multiple choice answers are found. Multiple choice answers are found right there. Okay, have fun with it. Here's a time. Yeah, the mode, and I just saw that comment. The mode is a pretty decent way to think about this. The most common outcome, the way the world works. Okay, if you need 30 or 40 more seconds to address the question, feel free, but make sure it's only 30 or 40 more seconds at most. If you got to guess, just guess. Okay. Let's wrap this up here. If your name is hitting the keyboard randomly, or Abhi, or Andrea, Frederick, Marco, Ravi, Rajitha, Ravi, other Ravi, Venkat, or Vlad, go ahead and pick an answer, please. Remember, if you have a staring contest with the GMAT, you will lose and the GMAT will win. That's how this works. GMAT will outstare you. So go ahead and pick an answer, please. Okay, so here are the choices that you have picked so far. more. There are still a few non-responders, but we can't really wait too much longer. So it looks like A and B are not super popular answers, but C, D, and E have gotten equal time here. All right, C a little bit less so, but D and E, okay. So let's talk about it. But still, look at this look at the overall evenness of this. So people are having some trouble with this. Can somebody explain this? Okay, I mean, let me tell you guys a story about Ron, which is that one of the reasons why I do pretty well at this test is that honestly, my brain is a lot like the brain of a really big 10-year-old. Well, what I mean by that is I'm not very good at abstractions. Like, really, I don't understand them. So when I say explain to a 10-year-old, this is one of those things where I practice exactly what I preach. Like, when I look at a critical reasoning passage, I have to do this. Like, I have to boil it down into simple enough terms that I can explain it to a fifth grader, because honestly, things that a fifth grader could not understand, I could not understand either. So the only difference between me and a literal fifth grader is that I'm probably a little bit faster at understanding stuff, and more importantly, I can read this kind of text, which a fifth grader could not read. So that's the difference. But the point is, if you showed me a philosophy book, which is all abstract, I would just not understand anything that the book said, because it's too abstract for me. So, but if you know any fifth graders, or if you know me, I mean, you got to make things concrete here. So. Let's see if anybody can do that. Can anybody type in the chat box a summary of this in like a line or two? Because you can definitely get this passage down to a couple of lines. Like in particular, the 25% and the 2%, those mean things that are not literally 25% and 2%. You should get something out of those numbers. So actually, the argument is trying to say that fasting is bad, but it should be a little bit. Notice it's not first grader; it's fifth grader. I mean, you can explain the specifics. You don't need this. You don't need to make it like I pick this age of 10 or 11 very specifically because if you know anybody who is that age, like they can totally understand very complex ideas as long as they are concrete. As long as they are not abstractions. Like something like fasting is bad for pregnant women is more like what you would say to a first grader or a second grader. Yeah, it's okay. It's kids do better, except for we still need the November thing because both of you guys are making the connection automatically that the argument makes. Like we're trying to break the connection between November and fasting. That's what we're trying to do here. So you also need to include that, right? Like, okay, so that's a good start. Let's make sure that you don't lose the November thing because that's what we're trying to explain here in the first place. So the deal here is that what you should get out of all of this blue stuff is that the babies that are November babies weirdly do better in school. Because if you think about the numbers, what you're supposed to get out of 25% and 2% is that those are respectively higher and lower than you would expect. And I mean, if this were random, then you would expect about a 12th of everybody to be in each of these groups. Like if it were random, that's what you would expect. So if this were random, you'd expect about 1/12 of each group to be born in each month, to have been born in each month. Maybe slightly less for February, but it's about the same, right? So, but this is, in other words, November babies are way overrepresented in the top of the group, in the top quintile, and way underrepresented in the bottom quintile. So that's the point there, right? So that's what you should get out of the whole blue thing. The whole blue thing is basically just that November kids do weirdly well on cognitive tests. That's the whole blue thing. You don't need to, for the 10-year-old, you don't need the percentages, man. You just need, like, these kids are really acing the test more than kids born in other months. How weird. That's kind of strange. So the question is, we want to know why. And then what they say is that that's the month, because the fasting is in November and is in December and January. So basically the November kids are the only kids whose moms didn't fast while they were pregnant with them. So yeah, we're going to get there, unicorn, in a second, but that's pretty much the deal, right? So the deal is, whoever's talking to you says, well, those are the only kids who never went through fasting as fetuses. So that must be why. So, in other words, we want to weaken that argument. Weaken that argument means we need another reason. We need a reason that is not related to fasting, and that's the point. Because this is how conversations work. If you're like, X must be the reason why something happened, if you want to weaken that, you have to give a reason that is not X. So we need a non-fasting related reason. We need a reason unrelated to fasting for why the November kids are scoring so well. So that's what we need. So the color coding pretty much gives you what these criteria are already. Which is, again, if you were having a conversation about this, then you would really understand what the boundaries were naturally. So this is one criterion. It has to have nothing whatsoever to do with fasting. And it also has to have especially a relationship to November. So now let's consider these individually, these choices. So choice A doesn't really do either of these things. Choice A basically says this is our whole data set. I mean, because the data set we have is the last 10 years. But I mean, if something like this happens for 10 years in a row, then that's pretty good evidence that something is going on. I mean, we don't need more than 10 years of data to really decide this. So this doesn't really weaken anything. If we only had 1 year of data, fine, something weird could have happened, like who knows, right? Weird things happen, like accidents and pollution, Chernobyl accident kind of thing could happen once and screw everybody over in a given set of months, but not for 10 years in a row. The same thing with B. I mean, B doesn't address either issue either. Because B just says that some kids miss the test and can't make them up. But there's no reason to think that that would affect birth month. Because, I mean, why would the kids who missed the test be more likely to have been born in any month? So, that's not really a thing. Okay, well, we'll get there. We'll get to choice E in a second. What does choice C mean to a 10-year-old? Why is choice C a thing? So if you look at what Unicorn has conveniently explained to us, if this is true, then this means that these kids born in November are the oldest kids in their class. That's what that means. And remember, this is first grade, right? This is when kids are like 6 years old. So in that context, the 1 year of development means a lot. I mean, a kid who is 6 years old versus a kid who is 7 years old, that's going to be a vast, I mean, that's like a 20% difference almost in developmental years. So that's a big deal. I mean, this means that the November kids are oldest, which would totally explain both of these things, right? This has nothing to do with fasting, because the November kids are the oldest ones regardless of fasting. And also, there is a strong and clear connection between being the oldest kids in a first grade class and being more developmentally and cognitively advanced. Yeah, right? It's like telling people you're 6.5, right? You know that half makes a difference. You know, I'm not going to walk around telling people right now I'm 39.5, because it just doesn't make any difference, right? So, exactly, that's a pretty good way to think about it. But that's the deal. And I mean, notice there's a real world connection here. You cannot play that down. You're going to have to make, I like that, you're going to have to make real world connections, right? It's going to happen. That's the point of these problems, is for you to make connections like that. Connections like, okay, people will not hire trainers for 20 years in a row. Or kids who are a year older than other kids in first grade will be cognitively more advanced on average. Or in other problems, you know, taller buildings tend to be in cities, or people who might get caught doing something will think twice about doing it, or lots of unremarkable real world facts come into play in these problems. Like, this is not a genius connection, but what it is a connection that you have to understand real world life to make. And in other words, connections that a computer could not make. If you're trying to do this with rules, then this will just not really be a thing. As far as choices D and E, what choice D does is it's just more of the same that we're trying to explain. Like, I mean, because D is really just another thing. I mean, D is saying that November kids are also better off in this way, but we still don't know why. Right, so this is like another aspect of the same issue, but it's not, there's no explanation. Like, it's another thing, another observation along the same lines, but still no explanation. And we still don't know why, right? Like, if you have choice D, like what we used to know before was, oh, the November kids have higher test scores, how weird. Now what we know is the November kids have higher test scores, and they are in better physical shape. Oh, how weird. The point is, how weird is still the same. I mean, if someone is hypothesizing that it's fasting, they could very much still hypothesize that it's fasting. Like, D doesn't really strengthen the argument because it doesn't have anything to do with fasting. It just, if anything, it just shows you that the problem is more pervasive than just academic performance. But it still, it doesn't give you any more or less explanation of why. I mean, what D would do is it would rule out the reason in C. Because, like, if it was a school class year thing, then, I mean, obviously your physical development has nothing to do with what year your school starts. So then, if D were true, then it would not be the reason in choice C, but that's not, you don't compare answer choices versus each other. You compare them versus the argument. So that's not only one. And then as far as choice E was the most popular choice among people in this study hall. But see, here's the problem with choice E. If it were this, then that would explain that 25%. But then this 2% would be even more of a weird thing. Because if it was just, whoa, I mean, because, okay, you could see why this might be a thing, right? I mean, honestly, if I had to fast for 2 months, then, you know, in February, I think my wife and I would get pretty frisky. But, you know, maybe that would happen a lot, and then a lot of kids would be born in November. But even if that was a thing, if there were just this huge crop of babies being born in November, that doesn't explain what we found here, because what we found here is not just more of them across the board. What we found is more of them in the top quintile and fewer of them in the bottom quintile. So this doesn't explain anything. Like, if this were an explanation, then we would expect both quintiles to have disproportionate amounts of November babies. So if this were true, then the percentages in both quintiles would be higher. So that's the problem, right? You would have more of everybody in November. So we want C. Any questions? But, like, coming back to unicorns, I mean, perhaps even snarky comment about 6.5. I mean, even if that was supposed to be, you know, humorous or nothing more than humorous, it's still a really good way to think about it. Because the more connections you can make between these and just everyday, normal, unremarkable life, the better off you will be. I mean, that's the point of these problems, is you have to have a focus, but this focus is natural to conversation. I mean, conversations have a weirdly specific focus. And I mean, if you don't appreciate that, just next time you're having a talk with anybody about anything, just pause and think, and just reflect on how weirdly specific the conversation always is. You know, like if you're talking about, should my friend move to Texas for work, then there are three focuses there that you have to be addressing at all times: my friend, Texas, and work. In an academic context, that would be very hard to do. But in conversation, even though it is three separate points of focus, we do it without even thinking about it. So, CONSOM, if you think it's far-fetched, I don't know why you would think it was far-fetched. Perhaps you could explain that. I mean, the oldest kids doing better is definitely not far-fetched. I mean, if you look at, for example, in Little League Baseball here in the U.S., there's usually some kind of birthday cutoff for different divisions, and the kids who are closest to that birthday cutoff absolutely are the best baseball players in the youth leagues. Like, so this is not any sort of weird, far-fetched thing. I mean, like one year of development in a kid is a big, big, big deal, especially a kid as young as first grade. So, but if you think it's far-fetched, you know, feel free to explain why that might be so. Okay, let's move to another question. Let's look at this. Yeah, and I mean, it does have to be convincing. Like, you will not get things that are tangentially weakeners, but you do not have to destroy arguments. But you have to give reasoning that will be compelling enough that, like, in a courtroom, like, think about how courtrooms would work for a civil lawsuit. Not for a criminal lawsuit, because criminal lawsuits are, you know, beyond any reasonable doubt. But for a civil lawsuit, you know, someone sues a corporation for like $1 million and says they're responsible for whatever damages. It's what a court would need to really substantiate that. It's not proof. It's just enough evidence to really believe that it's likely. So, I mean, Marco, I mean, that's kind of how development works in children. I mean, we're not assuming that older marches in lockstep with smarter. Otherwise, these percentages would be 100%. At 0%. But we absolutely are assuming, yes, a correlation between being a year older and being better at cognitive tasks. Absolutely we are assuming that, because that is a thing. Okay. Here is another question. This one's shorter, give you less time. Go for it. Have fun. Okay, we should be about done with this. This has a lot fewer words than most of these, so that means less time. Also, especially with critical reasoning, honestly, people, the marginal benefit of spending additional time tends to be pretty much zero, if not negative. Because remember that the issues in these passages will totally be things that you can identify as issues more or less immediately in a conversational context. Like if you were reading that problem about personal trainers, if you imagine talking to someone about that study, you would immediately know that the issue is, whoa, weird. Why did the personal trainer group do even worse than everybody else? You would know that immediately. You would know that it was the issue. And honestly, if you overthought the situation, you would probably be more likely to misidentify other things as issues. So if you're taking forever and ever, amen, to do these problems, then honestly you could probably do a little better by taking less time. You should still take as much time as you. Okay, I must have accidentally hit the mic button off. Thanks, guys. What was the last thing you heard me say? Was there anything that you heard me say at all? Chat box. What was the last words that you heard out of my mouth? Not, yeah, okay, so I must have accidentally turned it off in the middle of that. So that's basically the deal with not thinking. The deal with not taking too long is that if you were in a conversational context, you would totally know right away what the issue was once you had understood the words. Like if you were talking about the personal trainer issue, as soon as someone got done telling you, oh, there was a study that showed that everybody gained weight back, but especially the personal trainer group, you would immediately know that the issue was to explain the weirdness of the personal trainer group. Like to explain why those people especially were having more trouble than everybody else. You would just know that. You would right away know that. And honestly, you would not really think that other things were the issue unless you overthought it. Like unless you kept thinking and making up random connections. Like so honestly, you should take as much time as you need to do this first step. Like if it takes you a while to decode this text, and honestly, true story about Ron, not only am I sort of like a 10-year-old in the brain, I'm also dyslexic, so it sometimes takes me a while to read the text, and that's not, I would never rush that. Like I want an understanding of what's in the word. So if that step takes you a while, then take a while. Do not rush that step. But once you have read, so in other words, this should be slow and the answer choices should be fast. Because you want to understand this. If anything is unclear in the text, slow down, make it clear. But then once you understand what the issue is, don't take too much, don't dither over what the issue is. Because honestly, you'll understand. It's whatever you first think is the issue in an imaginary conversation in real life is definitely going to be the issue. So the question is, do you recommend whether it best to strengthen or weaken first? You should read this question first because you should understand what the goal is. Like for instance, if this were something else, like if this were what was assumed, then you would be reading the passage very differently. But as far as does it strengthen or weaken, I would say don't read the passage with a prejudice towards strengthening or weakening. Like you should read here. Let me, at the risk of answering this in a way that is sort of trite, let me give you what I usually tell people in response to this question. I would say read like a judge, not a lawyer. And if you already understand what I mean by that, then good. If not, a really quick explanation is, in other words, it's two things. Like you should know that you should know that you're going to have to decide whether a case is strong or weak, because that's what judges do. But unlike a lawyer, you have not picked a side yet. You should just absorb the argument and see what people are saying. So you should be aware that you will have to, ultimately take sides. But don't take sides yet. Because like same thing with here's the problem with taking sides too early. Let's go back to that problem about amaretti and people fasting. Here is that one. Okay, like if you are a lawyer, I mean, it's not literally a lawyer, but if you already are taking the pro-fasting side of this one, then you're going to think that D is more evidence for you. Because you're going to be like, aha, that's another problem with November kids. Which means that, oh, fasting must be at fault. The problem is if you were a judge, so to speak, if you knew that we were discussing what the reason was, but we had not yet decided whether it was fasting, then you would know this was inconclusive. Like you would look at this and you would say, you know what, this just gives us even more fuel for debate, but it doesn't resolve anything. You see what I mean? Like if you take sides too early, then you might misread neutral statements as though they were on one side or the other. Which is, you know, people do that. It's called prejudice. It happens in the world. So watch out for that being a thing. So you should know, be a judge. That's the best way to think about it. Like you should know that you are going to have to eventually make some sort of decision based on this evidence, but you don't need to prematurely decide what that decision will be. It's kind of a long-winded answer, but that's an important question. So. Sure. All right, explain to a 10-year-old, okay, what's going on here is you have these birds, you have these Croton's jays, and they basically hitchhike with these crook beaks. So these birds, these jays, the jays never go south alone. They never go south without crook beaks as escorts. And like ever, even if they get lost, they just wait for another crookbeak to happen along. And so what that means, according to the speaker, is so they must depend upon, like they must not be able to migrate by themselves. Okay, there we go. I mean, if you think about this, you don't want to think about it for too long, but you could come up with other reasons. I mean, maybe they like eat the remains of the crookbeak's food out of their beaks. You know, some birds eat from the beaks of other birds. Or maybe they're just lazy. I mean, I can sympathize with that. Or, you know, maybe they like draft on the crookbeaks and they like don't have to face as much wind resistance. Or like, who knows, right? There are a lot of other reasons why they might do this, but what we're saying is that they do it because they just cannot find their own way. So the argument is they cannot find their own way. That's what we're trying to do. So they must not be able to find their own way. All right. Well, let's talk about that, shall we? So we want more evidence that the jays can't find their own way. Like, notice what is not at issue. Like, we do not need to argue that they are specifically dependent upon crookbeak. Because the identity of the escort is not the point here. If you read the words just say they lack the navigational ability. The words don't say they need specifically crookbeaks to be the escort. I mean, maybe they could just as easily follow a plane that's going from New York to Miami. I mean, who knows, right? So, but the point is that they have to follow something. That's the point. It doesn't have to be a crookbeak. It just has to be a thing that is also going south and then going back north in the spring. So they have to follow something. The group answer distribution, not that anybody should really care, but there you go. So people like choice C on this one, with choice A being a decently close second. Not that anybody really cares. I mean, it's your answer distribution which matters at the end of the day, but there. Okay, understand the criteria that a correct answer must address. Well, also make sure you understand the criteria that it doesn't have to address, too. I mean, that's just as important. It's important, like, for example, it's important to understand here that the crookbeaks can't it has to have some reason to believe that the J's can't navigate, but it doesn't need to it doesn't need any relation to crook beefs, because the nature of the escort is not the point right now. So, Kunal, there are never trick questions on the GMAT. Never, ever, 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 ever. It does not happen. The GMAT will never stick a foot out and try to trip you, because that's not why this test exists. It's really not. There are people who really want it to be that kind of test, but it's not that kind of test. So, even if they inadvertently wrote a question that was a trick question, it would get washed out in the experimental stage because people would have the wrong statistical performance on it. So it's not. There are never going to be nitpicks. Honestly, there's not. If you are nitpicking really weird, extreme cases of something in critical reasoning, that means that you are not going about this the right way. Okay. In terms of these things, like A gives you a reason to think that the argument is wrong. I mean, like A is actually a weakener in the argument, because what A points to is the idea that it's not a navigational issue at all. I mean, it means, in other words, it's this. In other words, i.e., not a navigation issue, but a reproduction issue. Like A says that they follow the crook beefs to make it easier for them to have baby birds, not to navigate, you know. It's like they're following them down there for spring break to, like, you know, have babies. Except not by accident, like human spring breakers. Okay. Choice B, we don't care about species like crook beefs because that's totally not the point. Choice C is more reason to believe that they need to hitch rides. And in fact, the idea that this is a different kind of bird actually makes our case even better, because like C tells you that they also have to have an escort to go back north, and C also tells you that there is nothing particularly special about crook beefs. So C is a great answer to this. I mean, it shows you that they also hitch rides. And on top of that, it also shows you that they are relatively indiscriminate in whom to hitch rides with. You know, so in other words, C not only supports the argument, but also rules out crook beefs being special in any way. It's a nice answer choice. Choice D is irrelevant because we don't care about other birds. We only care about these J's. And then E would weaken the argument because it shows you, because we don't know that they're hitching a ride with anyone else, and we know that they are not hitching a ride with crook beefs. So, yeah. Any questions about this one, feel free. If not, I was a few minutes late here, so we can do another one. Let's do another one. Let's do... let's see. How about that one? A short one. Remember, short doesn't mean easy. Short just means short. So less time. Here is where you find multiple choice answers. Right there. And there's not a lot of words in this one, so I'll give you proportionally less time, and then we will. The discussion of this one will be a little bit rushed, but at least it'll allow us to get one more problem in there. So go for it. Okay, let's pick a thing. Let's take a thing that is a thing. You know, next 10 seconds or something. Also, remember, as far as time management on these things, just make sure that you have a goal. I mean, you don't need to count down minutes and seconds religiously. In fact, I'm probably giving you the wrong idea, even by putting a timer on top of the screen. But time management consists of basically not ever randomly wandering through a problem. That includes math and verbal. Like when you read the passage, you should have a goal, which is to make it conversational or directly personal and to understand what the issue is. And then once you have that issue, the goal becomes, what do I specifically want in an answer choice? And these three captions that we put here in our orange boxes, these things, I mean, these are basically what you are doing. But these are goals. I mean, at any given point, you should have one of these as your specific goal. And if you're still working on this problem where working is in quotation marks after a certain amount of time, it probably means you don't have one of these specific goals anymore. So just make sure that you always, always, always have a goal. Okay. So what's going, I mean, the difficulty, unicorn question difficulty is not a thing that you should ever, ever, ever think about. I mean, honestly, if you're interested in question difficulty, it would probably be better for me to not show you the distribution because you don't care. I mean, it's not something that will ever help you analyze a problem, and if you are thinking about it, it will, if you're thinking about it at all ever, it will be a distraction that will reduce the amount of brain power you have available for the task. So honestly, if that's the reason why people want the distribution, then I should probably not show the distribution. So, and I mean, as far as common mistakes, that's also not a good thing to think about. Because if you are not making a mistake, then you don't need to think about it. That's the point. Like here, let me just, not to make an example of anybody here, but you guys are all anonymous anyway, so who cares? Here's what people are saying. Like, these are two things that honestly you guys should just not ever think about. This is who cares. Really, it's not. I mean, difficulty, you should not care about difficulty unless you write tests. Unless you write adaptive tests, you don't care. I mean, it's kind of like, because you won't know. In fact, the very fact that you are asking about this is proof of why you don't care about it. Like, if you have to ask, that means you don't know. And if you don't know, that means it's never any sort of basis of a strategy. So there you go. You won't know, so taking this into account would be pointless. You know, it would be like trying to judge whether you should talk to some member of the opposite sex based on their blood type. I mean, even if blood typing had something to do with that, it would still not be useful because you cannot look at someone and see what their blood type is. So who cares? It's not going to work. There you go. And also, it would, on top of this, more insidiously, if you are thinking about difficulty at all, ever, then you are misdirecting effort, that you're misdirecting brain power. Because I mean, okay, here's an analogy, right? Let's say, it's kind of a stupid but effective analogy. Like, imagine that I'm shooting a gun at you for 5 minutes and saying, dance, and you have to dodge the bullets so that you don't die. Okay, in those situations, imagine how much more likely you would be to die if you spent even 1% of your brain power thinking about how difficult it was to dodge the last bullet. You see what I mean here, right? There's no reason to think about it, and it will just make you less likely to dodge the next bullet that comes. So don't do it. And then the other thing is honestly, guys, I mean, there are a million zillion mistakes that people make on these things, but if you are not making those mistakes, honestly, you shouldn't really care. I mean, if you, like here, as far as common mistakes, you are not a population of people, so you don't care. Like, if you are not making these mistakes, then there's no benefit of thinking about that and considering that. In fact, you know what, let me tell you a story here. So, you know, when I was much younger, I was a track and field athlete, and, you know, we would, for the 100-meter and the 110-meter hurdles where we were all in the starting blocks together on a straight line, we could, like, talk smack to each other in the starting blocks. And, you know, you say things to each other like, oh, you know, hey, I saw you warming up in the end. Your left leg was a little bit weird. You know, what you're doing there is you're trying to get the person. I mean, obviously nothing is wrong with the person's left leg. You're just messing with their head. But now they're thinking about their left leg, and it's going to make them perform worse. It's going to make them think about something that they don't have to think about. They're thinking about fixing something that's not broken. And that's what you'll do here. Like, if you think about common mistakes that other people who are not you are making, then you are going to distract yourself from your own thought process for no reason. So don't do it. So if these are the reasons why people want to see the distribution, then I'm actually deciding right now that I will never show the distributions again, because these are not things that you want to think about. So even if 98% of the class, i.e. everybody except you, even if everyone except you picks the answer choice, honestly, you don't care. I mean, because we do talk about the other choices. Like in the Amoretti problem, in all of these problems, we're discussing all of the choices. So that is, that's the thing. We're going to talk about all the choices. If we only talked about select answer choices, that would be a reason. But okay, decision is made. Okay, let's talk about this. All right. Explain to a 10-year-old what's going on here is, but honestly, that benefits everybody, because if you are thinking about answer distributions, honestly, that's just going to negatively affect, forever and ever, absolutely, amen, in perpetuity, as long as we all shall live. Okay. Explain to a 10-year-old, so there's a dense text in this one. I have to read this a couple of times, so if you have to read it a couple of times, no worries, right? People have issues with sulfites. So winemakers are deciding not to add sulfites to their wine so that people who have this issue are theoretically not affected. So, I mean, NL, that's true if it's a personal feedback, but not if it's a feedback about how strangers are doing. I mean, just think about the track and field story there. It's not a good thing. I mean, a lot of people want random data because they just like data. I mean, if that's you, then you should introspect a little bit and figure out if that is you. If you're just the type of person who likes to look at data, then fine. Okay. You can have 2 unicorn because I am a non-drinker, so you can have one for me too. Okay, so let's talk about this. So people have issues with sulfites. Some wines have sulfites added to them. So those are going to cause issues, obviously. So for those guys. So then what winemakers are doing is they're thinking about making wine without added sulfites. Okay. The point being they think this will make the wine safe for the people with sulfite issues. . So the deal is, if they don't, so the specifics are, the plan is to not add sulfites. So will not adding the sulfites ensure that there are no sulfites in the wine. Because what you should do, see, here's the story. If you have to explain this to a 10-year-old, then you're going to say to the 10-year-old, you're going to be like, dude, if there are any sulfites, and the awesome thing about 10-year-olds is that even if they are girls, you can still call them dude. If there are any sulfites in this wine, then there are going to be issues. In other words, if we do that, there will be no sulfites. Okay. Does anybody see any issues there? Will not adding sulfites ensure that there are actually no sulfites? Does anybody see what the problem is? If you want to weaken this argument, then what do you have to come up with? Yeah, well, it's other things that people are allergic to, no, because we are restricting the discussion to the people who have sulfite issues. What we need is, because I mean, the only way that this will be not a solid argument is if there are still what in that wine? Is if there are still sulfites, I'm sure. Exactly the point, right? The only way this can be wrong, the only possible fault here, is if there still might be sulfites. Because we are not adding any of them, and so if there are none of them already there, then this is not a thing. I mean, in this case, you might be able to predict. You will not always be able to predict the answer. Like, I doubt that very many of you would have predicted the November answer. But in some things, if you think this situation through, you'll be able to predict exactly what the issue is. So if you look at these choices, sulfites occur naturally in most wine, there you go. It means that the problem won't be solved. There's still sulfites. Even if they're not added, there are still non-added sulfites that are there. So this is the one we want. As far as the other choices go, we don't care about beverages other than wine because we're only talking about wine. We're not talking about costs. We're not talking about non-sulfite allergies, which we're only concerned with sulfites. And then we are not talking about yield. We're not talking about, wastage or we're not talking about it. There's a legal term for this, not that you really care, but it's called spoliation. We're not talking about it's when things become unusable or their useful life is over or undrinkability. We're not talking about this. Like, we're just saying, can it be drunk without sulfite allergies? So E says that it might become undrinkable for other reasons, but it's only sometimes. So if it doesn't become undrinkable, then there you go. Would it be the next bet? I mean, there won't really be a next bet. I mean, basically things will either address the issue or they won't. So, because they would still risk. I mean, with E, we're not changing the situation. We're not changing the landscape of whether these non-added sulfites are dangerous. Like, if the non-added sulfites are safe in the argument, they're still just as safe in E. And if they are dangerous, they are still just as dangerous. So Rahul, it says allergic reactions, but it's not allergic reactions to sulfites. In fact, it is specifically non-sulfites, which means we don't care. What you can do if you still don't love these problems is you can make analogies to them. Imagine replacing sulfites with caffeine, and imagine replacing wine with coffee. And this problem will probably be much easier to understand. Like many people have bad reactions to caffeine, and some manufacturers add caffeine to their coffee. God bless their souls. So if they don't add caffeine to coffee, then people could, drink that even if they have caffeine issues. Probably more clear, right? There's still a lot of caffeine in coffee, which is why coffee is coffee. So even if you added caffeine to it, even if you did not add it, people with caffeine issues would still not drink it. So this is choice A. B would be that there are other drinks containing caffeine. Obviously, we don't care. C would be that it would be a cost issue, which we're not concerned with. D would be there's other things in caffeine, like theobromine in coffee, that also could cause issues, but we're not talking about theobromine. We're talking about caffeine. And then E would be some coffee spoils if you don't add extra caffeine to it. But you can tell that doesn't affect the core discussion. The core discussion is, could it be drunk at all, even if it did not spoil? So, there's a certain percentage of spoliation that it happens, but it doesn't address the issue. So there you go. All right, we gotta kill this here pretty soon. It's pretty far over time. So I like that too. I don't know what that is, but I guess I like it. Okay, so Marco, to answer your question, just pretend it's a conversation. If you make this a conversation in your head, you'll know which part is the punchline. I mean, sometimes the force of the argument comes right at the beginning. Because like sometimes people just make a statement and then justify it. Like here, you're really a jerk. Look at what you did. You did this and this and this. Like that's an argument whose conclusion is you are a jerk, which comes first, and then all the evidence comes later. So, Marco, yeah, we do about half of these for quant. I mean, if you look back through the archives, there are like a billion gazillion of both quant and verbal. But yeah, we'll eventually do quant. I don't ever know what we're doing in these sessions until like right before them, as in like less than an hour. So I don't know what we're doing. Not next week. It's going to be 2 weeks. March 6th is the next date. So, all right, let's kill it. I'm going to kill the recording at this point.